Välkommen till Stolpe Stories, en podcast om litteratur och humaniora från Bokförlaget Stolpe. Vår värd för programmet är Patrik Hadenius.
This episode of Stolpe Stories will be about Ukraine. I welcome Serhii Plokhy.
It's a pleasure to be on the podcast, and I'm very happy to be able to talk to the readers and maybe potential readers of my book, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine.
We're really happy that you're here in Stockholm. You are a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University and a director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. You grew up in Ukraine, but now you live in Boston, Massachusetts. Your book, in English called The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, and in Swedish it's called Porten till Europa, Ukrainas historia. It covers the known history of Ukraine. I say the known because you're a historian, so you go to the sources and see what happened. From the earliest written sources, Herodotus, to the Russian aggression and up until the war. We meet both Vikings and the Swedish 17th century empire, stormaktstiden as we say in Swedish. But let's start with the book's title. You call it Gates of Europe. What do you mean by that?
There is a number of layers of that meaning, but the basic thing that I put into the book, I look at the history of Ukraine as a history of multiple borderlands. Ukraine was a meeting place for not just centuries, for almost millennia, of different cultures, different civilizations, different empires. Ukraine is at the western edge of the Eurasian steppe area that, if you start in the east, starts with the Pacific and goes all the way to the Carpathian Mountains and to the Danube. And Ukraine is right there, at the end of Eurasian steppes and at the beginning of what we consider today to be Central Europe. And that location really defined a lot in Ukrainian history and continues to really define the fortunes and misfortunes of the place where I was born and whose history I am writing.
Yes, and central to this is, of course, the Dnieper River that flows in the center of today's Ukraine, but it hasn't always been in the center of that.
Dnieper, or in Ukrainian Dnipro, this is certainly the largest river in the area, and it connects the wooded areas of Eastern Europe with the Black Sea. Historically, that was the place how you can get, at the time of the Vikings, to the richest markets in the world. What used to be through the 20th century New York, maybe, or London, back in the Middle Ages was Byzantium. That's where you wanted to be. That was really the center of the world. And to get from the north to the Black Sea, to the Constantinople, you had to get on the Dnieper River. I suspect that it is also the part of the story of Ukraine that is well known for people here in Stockholm. The last time I was here, I visited Viking Museum, and Dnipro was right there, and the Dnieper Rapids were there as well. So, yeah, that part of history that Ukraine and Sweden certainly shares.
Yes, and as you said, the target was not what we call today Ukraine. It was to go to the Black Sea and then go to Constantinople, right?
Yes, basically the business model was that it was too difficult to produce or take anything from Scandinavia and bring it all the way to the Black Sea. So what the Viking leaders created, they taxed the population of today's Belarus, Baltic states, Russia, and Ukraine. And taxes were not just, there was little money. There was honey, there was wax, but mostly there were slaves that those groups were capturing, fighting with each other. And then the collecting point for all these goods was the city that is the capital of Ukraine today, Kiev. It was located back in the Middle Ages at the point where the steppes meet the forested area. That's also the area where a number of tributaries join Dnieper River, so it's easy to bring goods to that place. To put it on the boats, it's still safe. And then you cross yourself if you're a Christian, you pray to your gods if you are not, and you start on this very dangerous journey through the steppe areas of Ukraine. But the journey would start in Kyiv with if you are lucky, eventually you will get in Constantinople and you will bring your merchandise, whatever it is. Either it's human beings or there are the products of the forest from today's Eastern Europe.
Mm. We will perhaps come back to the Vikings in the year 860. They arrived at the first time in Constantinople, as we know.
Yes. Yeah. 1860s, that's where the Vikings appear for the first time coming from the north.
Yes. But when they traveled through Kiev, or the village that was there then, the Vikings, of course, wasn't first. You talk about nomads and the Slavic people. They were already there. When did they arrive?
We really don't know. It's a part of history which predates, of course, written sources. But we are on the verge of major breakthroughs with the fantastic results coming from the DNA analysis. So at some point we will know exactly when they came, when they arrived. That was part of this big resettlement of the peoples from Africa, going through the Caucasus into Europe, and then going the other way into Asia and all the way into the Americas. So the Slavs were part of that story. Now, what was good about the Vikings, and most of what I was saying was not particularly exciting for the local population, for the Slavs. But what was good about the Vikings was that for the first time they organized their area. With the Vikings, you have a creation and foundation of the first state where the decisions are made in Kyiv. The Vikings eventually, within 2 generations, maybe less, go native, adopt Slavic names, become integrate into the local elite, and they create the first state structure that we know in the region focused on Kyiv, which positions itself really as one of the largest empires of medieval Europe. So the Vikings become part of this process of sovereignization, for the lack of a better word, of what is today Ukraine and parts of Belarus and Russia as well.
And you write about 3 men, one the great, one the brave, and then the wise.
That's how the chroniclers and then historians decided to distinguish them. But one of them was Sviatoslav. We know about his wife, Helgi, Olga, who became a saint in the Orthodox Church. And then the next was Volodymyr in Ukrainian, or probably Valdemar in some Nordic iteration of that name. He was the one who established himself in power in Kyiv, like many of his predecessors, by coming to Scandinavia, getting the army here, and then going to Kyiv and saying, okay, I'm the king, I'm the ruler. So he was the last to do that. But he was also someone who treated Byzantium in a different way from his predecessors. If the predecessors had this idea that, well, we will go to Byzantium and we sell our goods and we'll become rich and we'll come back to Scandinavia, he already established his headquarters in Kyiv. The first to do that was Sviatoslav. He was not sure what to do, whether to establish on Dnieper River or on the Danube, because there were goods coming to the Black Sea from Central and Western Europe, and he was thinking maybe actually a better business model would be to be an intermediary between Central Europe and Byzantium. It didn't work well for him. He was defeated eventually. So the consolation prize for his sons and grandsons became Kyiv. And Volodymyr there decided actually to join the family of the European rulers, and more specifically to join the family of the Emperor of Byzantium, Basil II. Well, there was this strange warlord, neither Slavic nor Scandinavian. God knows who he is, what he wants. And he went to the Crimea. He attacked the Byzantine fortress there named Chersones and said, well, here is the deal. Either I marry your sister or I keep the Crimea, I keep the city of Chersonesus. And that was quite persuasive.
Was that Anna? Or
it was Anna. But there was a deal, and apparently Vladimir Valdemar didn't mind that. The deal was that to become member of the family of the Byzantine ruler, he had to accept Christianity.
Yes. So that was the time where Christianity came to Kiev.
Right. And there is a date and year for the Christianization of Kievan Rus. But it's as misleading as trying to draw the borders of the states in the medieval Europe and assuming that they are the states like we have today. The borders were porous, there was no border control, and the same is true for the events. Those were not events, those were processes.
Exactly. And now you use the name Kievan Rus here, but that was not the name the people used at that time. It's a later construction, right?
Exactly. So Kievan Rus is the term for that medieval state with the dynasty that was basically a Viking dynasty. And it took root in historiography somewhere in the mid-19th century. We still use it.
Yes, but Rus was actually a name you could use at that time because we think that the name Rus that now is used in Russia, for example, it came with the Vikings.
Yes, absolutely. There were a long period of time in the Russian historiography where the idea that the Vikings were, or the Normans were the first dynasty in the Kievan state and to a degree creators of the state was really considered to be politically dangerous. So that pushback started really in the late 18th century. So there were alternative theories developed that, okay, really the Vikings were Slavs, they were Western Slavs. So that feels much better than Russia was not run by those awful Normans, but fellow Slavs. And then there is a river in south of Kiev called Ros. And there was a theory that, at least when I went to school, that's what teacher of history explained to me, that Rus comes really from the river Ros near Kiev. As a Ukrainian, I didn't question that. I like the idea. As a historian, I became more skeptical. And the theory that we have today is that the term comes really from the way how the Finns called the Scandinavians, and they called them Rootsi, and that meant apparently the people who roar. And today when you do excavations, archaeological excavations of the graves in Ukraine, by the way how the skeletons are deformed, you can immediately tell the nomad from the Viking, because the Vikings' deformations come from rowing again and again and again. And the nomad, whoever they are, either Pechenegs or Mongols or Khazars, they have a different sort of deformation on their body from spending too much time on the horseback.
So let's jump a bit forward in history. I don't know where you want to stop, because then came the Mongols and then we have the Poland, Lithuania, the great powers that kind of divided the country. What happened then?
Yes, you mentioned the word divided, and certainly you mentioned it correctly. There was a division along the Dnieper River, but the term divide and division is overused.
Okay.
Generally for that period of late medieval period and then early modern period. The traditional narrative of Russian history coming from the 19th century is that, and to a degree it resonates with what you hear today coming from Moscow, from Putin, that there was this golden age. There was this wonderful Russian state. Somehow the capital was in Kiev, but okay, let's forget about that. There was a Russian state with a wonderful Russian nation that lived there. And then there were all sorts of awful foreign invaders that divided Russia. And this is very much the Western or other foreign intrigue against Russia. And Mongols are the first in this list of enemies that divided Russia. The truth is that Mongols actually were so successful in conquering what was Kievan Rus, because Kievan Rus already was divided into more than 24 principalities, and they couldn't resist, they were not united. What Mongols did, they viewed in traditional Russian history as dividers. They were actually the group that created the unity, the sort of unity that didn't exist before they came. Because they came, again, their business model also to collect tribute from that population. And it was a headache to deal with this 20 or 30 different princes. And so they created an office that didn't exist before them, the Grand Prince. And out of 30 principalities, they created 3 big spaces. So out of 30, there were 3, but again, the traditional Russian narrative says, okay, there was one, this Kievan Rus, and then Mongols came and suddenly you have 3, and then the division started between one big Russian nation into these groups that became eventually Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians. So the Mongols are charged with this crime of the dividing of the big Russian nation. And I'm trying to show in my book that, well, on contrary, they were trying their best to unite, to make some sense out of the mess that the Kievan Rus was already in the 13th century. And later, what you see is that out of the part of that is Ukraine and Belarus, that part becomes part of the very important state, early modern state in East Central Europe called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with Belarus becoming part of the Lithuania, Grand Duchy of Lithuania within this one Commonwealth, and what is today Ukraine becoming part of the Kingdom of Poland. And that division, administrative division to a degree, but also political division, happens in the 16th century. And certainly becomes a major contributing factor to the creation of separate Belarusian and Ukrainian national identities later, already in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Reading your book, it's very obvious that all these tribes, all these nomads, all these warriors come in waves. And now I want to introduce the Cossacks as well, because they play a role here too. So who were the Cossacks and where did they come from?
The Cossacks come into existence when the agricultural societies become actually economically much more productive than the nomadic societies. They start this movement into the steppe with the idea of turning the nomad pastures into the farms and agriculturally productive areas. It's a dangerous undertaking. As you can imagine, nomads are not particularly crazy about this idea. They're still very, very militarily capable. And the Cossacks are really, at the same time, are involved in the warfare, in the trade, and in this agricultural economy. They are moving into the steppe the way how the Vikings were moving, along the rivers. So you look at the Dnipro River, and that's where the Ukrainian Cossacks are. You look further east at the Don River, and the Don Cossacks. And then Volga Cossacks with the Russian folk hero Stenka Razin, the leader of one of the uprisings. And you go all the way to the Amur, and you will find Cossacks there as well. So this is movement of the settled population into the Eurasian steppe areas, going along the rivers. Today, the Dnipro Cossacks are defined as Ukrainian and everyone else as Russians, which, again, is correct, is true in terms of how the ethnicity and identity of those groups eventually evolved. But the big story of the 16th and 17th century was that the Cossacks of the Dnipro, the Ukrainian Cossacks, were the ones who were successful in their revolt against the authorities and created their own state. Russian Cossacks, the best that they could achieve special rights under the Tsars, but they actually were the servants of the Tsars. that the Ukrainian Cossacks established their own statehood, which was quite bizarre because Cossacks sometimes are compared to the pirates, but of the steppes. You don't think really about pirates as creating a state of their own. You don't think about pirates sending their children to the universities, supporting libraries and supporting building of the churches, supporting the first university, Western-type university in the region, the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. The Ukrainian Cossacks were doing all of that. And the reason for that was, they managed to create a state of their own. They created elite of their own that was trying to be like any other elite. The only thing that the Cossack elite was prohibited to do, they couldn't own serfs, because the Cossack revolution was anti-serf revolution. So that was revolution that brought freedom. There were free people, which created headaches for the Cossack state. How do you create revenue if you don't have serfs? But it was in many ways the romantic writers of the 19th century really was excited about the Cossacks as a free republic. There was a lot of freedom there. There was a lot of non-freedom, but certainly they were freer than whoever was around them.
You mentioned the uprisings by the Cossacks, and there were several of those. And now we can connect to Sweden again, because there is a connection between the defeat in Poltava in Sweden, very famous, because it was the end of the Swedish Empire, but it was also devastating for what we now call Ukraine. And it has a connection to the Cossacks.
Absolutely. The Battle of Poltava, 1709, Poltava is, of course, in Ukraine. And it was a turning point. Now we understand that it wasn't clear in 1709, but it was the turning point, not just in the Northern War, but also in the fortunes of Sweden, that the victory was the foundation for the rise of Russia as a European power. And certainly it was a devastating thing for Sweden, but 2 or 3 times as devastating for Ukraine, because what happened in the year 1708, 1 year before the battle, was that King Charles XII decided to knock down Russia in that war, and made a major mistake, didn't look at the map, didn't do the math, and marched in the direction of Russia. I would put it that way.
He did a detour, we could say.
Right. It turned out that actually the road was not as good as maps showed, and it took much longer to get there. So winter was coming, and he was looking around where to make a stopover and then continue the campaign the next year. And he looked at Ukraine. And the Cossack hetman at that time, his name was Ivan Mazepa, was clearly very, very unhappy with the Peter I, or as he known is in the Russian historiography as Peter the Great, because the Russians were encroaching on this autonomous right of the Cossack elite, of the Cossack state. And Ivan Mazepa, who was considered to be a very loyal servant of Peter, decided to switch sides. The problem was that very few trusted him, that he was in a difficult situation. He decided to do that in utmost secrecy, because otherwise, of course, he would be exposed and probably killed. But what that meant also, when he switched sides, he didn't have time to do any propaganda around his people. So the Ukrainian Cossacks actually were taking part in the Battle of Poltava on both sides, the Mazepa and those who supported him on the side of Charles XII, and those who opposed on the side of Peter. But in both cases, more like auxiliary forces than the core of the army. Now, the loss for Charles, as I said, was double the loss for the Ukrainian statehood. After the Battle of 1709, and it's all downhill, the office of the hetman would be abolished. And when it was brought back and introduced, it was basically not the powerful hetmans of the past, but more like courtiers. Can you imagine the situation in which not just the Cossacks are doing warfare, agriculture, and trade, and support educational institutions. But the hetman of Ukraine is also the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. How he divided his time, it's difficult to say, but it's his credentials for being the hetman of Ukraine was that he was coming from a Cossack family in Ukraine. And credentials for being the president of the Academy of Sciences that he got a really very good Western education.
So that is the connection. And as you say, this was devastating for a lot of countries and Ukraine also. So let's move on to the 19th century when nationalism rises. Ukraine was then two states, right? One belonging to the Austrian emperor, one to the Russian Tsar. And they dealt with this rising nationalism in Ukraine in different ways. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, Ukraine was divided between the Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary, at that time Habsburg Empire, as the result of the partitions of Poland. And most of what is today Ukraine went, including the Cossack lands, went to the Russian Empire. 19th century, that's the time when the people in Europe in general start to form modern national identities. They need historical mythology. Here in Scandinavia, the national awakeners discover Vikings and turn them into a national symbol. In Ukraine, they discover Cossacks, and exactly the same process is happening. The trick was that the Cossacks were part of the Dnipro-Ukraine, which was under Russia. But the national mythology was so powerful that it crossed the border between Russia and Austria-Hungary. And the Cossacks became also the symbols of Ukrainian nationhood in Austria-Hungary, where most of the Ukrainian population were Greek Catholics, were under the Pope of Rome, and the Cossacks were known for anti-Catholic struggle. But it didn't matter anymore. The time of the religious wars passed. The time of the unification, national unification, across the imperial borders, across the religious borders came, and the Cossacks made it into the anthem of Ukraine that was written in mid-19th century that everyone sings today, whether they're Greek Catholics, whether they're Jews, whether they're Orthodox or atheists. So that was an interesting situation in which the mythology, the project, the modern national project as it was formed in Kiev in the first half of the 19th century crossed those boundaries between Austria-Hungary and Russia. But Russian state and Austria-Hungarian state dealt very differently with the rising Ukrainian nationalism, at that time cultural nationalism. The Russians already adopted the model that there was this golden age of Russian nation called Kievan Rus. And these strange guys, Kiev professors, artists, actors, and others who were running around with the idea that there was a separate Ukrainian language, were creating Ukrainian literature, they were very dangerous. They were more dangerous than were the Poles, who were Catholics and who were rising in one rebellion after another in the 19th century against the Russian Empire, because the Poles were outside of the big body of the Russian state and Russian nation. The Ukrainians were right in the middle of it, and they were trying to undermine not just the state, but the sense of nationhood, exactly at the time when Russians trying to figure out who they were at that time. So what they did, they banned for 40 years, up until the revolution of 1905, publications in Ukrainian. What that meant that the import of Ukrainian literature from the Austria-Hungary, where they published it, was prohibited. Any publication in Ukraine in the Russian Empire was prohibited. And they just tried to arrest the modern Ukrainian national project in that way. In Austria-Hungary, there was an attempt on the part of the Russian government to turn the local Ukrainians into the subgroup of the Russian nation. They called the Ukrainians in the Russian Empire Little Russians, and those who were in Austria-Hungary, the Russians. Again, all comes from Rus. It all goes back to the Vikings. And in Austria-Hungary, there were two, like in the Russian Empire, there were two groups within the Ukrainian elite that were fighting each other. One believed that they were a separate nation. Other believed that they, of course, had differences from the Russians. But at the end of the day, they were part of a bigger Russian nation. And what you see is that in Russian Empire, the Russian state supported those so-called little Russians who believed that Ukrainians are part of a big Russian nation. In Austria-Hungary, they supported those who believed that they were Ukrainians because Russia was a major rival of Austria-Hungary at that time. And also in Austria-Hungary, they were concerned about the Poles. And if there are Ukrainians who are not Russians and who are certainly anti-Polish, that would be good for the empire as well. So Austria-Hungary got a relatively small part of Ukraine, but that was part of Ukraine where the writers who were writing in Ukrainian from Russia could publish their works. And Ukraine got a very, very interesting situation where there were readers without writers and writers without readers, in a sense that they communicated with each other through texts, but they couldn't meet each other for coffee or tea. Bad thing for Ukrainian literature, great thing for the Ukrainian national project, because at the end you get one common canon of literature, of language, and eventually that's something that contributed to the formation of Ukrainian nation as it is now, that brings together Dnipro River and Dniester River, the Carpathian Mountains and the steppes of northern Black Sea area.
And now we need the listeners to go to your book and read about the industrialization, which came with the railroads, very important. And I want to move into the 20th century. In 1957, that year was special for you because that's the year you were born.
Yes, I don't remember that year at all, but clearly it was a very important year. It was also Sputnik year.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And you were born in Russia, but then you quite soon after that moved to Ukraine. How was it to grow up in Ukraine at that time?
Yeah, I was born in Russia. The Soviet Union had this system where the education, including the higher education, was free, but after you graduated, you had to go where the state decides that they need you the most. And that was the case with my father in particular, who graduated from the Polytechnic Institute in Zaporizhzhia in southern Ukraine. The only thing that I remember is growing up in Zaporizhzhia. And my first memories are about Gagarin flight in 1961. But then growing in Zaporizhzhia, which was and is at the heart of the former Cossack clans, I was also exposed to this Cossack mythology and historical mythology. So that was part of a life around me. But then when I went to the university in 1975, I found out that actually the study of the Cossacks is not welcomed, because a few years later, in 1972, a major policy change happened in Ukraine. They removed one of the communist leaders of Ukraine, accused him of idealization of the past and of Ukrainian nationalism for idealizing the Ukrainian Cossacks. So suddenly the Cossacks became a topic which was politically very problematic, and it stayed that way almost until the end of the Soviet Union. So studying early modern Ukraine, something that I was doing, you would use other terms than Cossacks, but still look at the same part of history. So by the time when I was at the university, I realized that the government was very much involved into the history writing and history education. And it was very, very dangerous for you as a historian to even study the periods that the government didn't want you to study. So that was really, really my first introduction into realm of history as a political battleground.
But then you were still in Ukraine when Perestroika was released by Gorbachev. So then you were active in a more free time, or what would you call it?
Absolutely. It seems to me the year 1989, when I and some of my colleagues and professors, there were three of us, we published a popular book in the local publishing house on the history of the Cossacks. That was really, really fascinating development. And our editor, who was publishing the book, He was probably the most excited about that. He was saying that only a few years earlier, the censors would cross out any reference to the Cossacks in any literature that he was editing or publishing, and suddenly it all became possible. We didn't know what is possible, what is not, so it was each time you take sort of a risk, and then you see, okay, you're not fired. Cool. I can go further. I can try a little bit more. So that was a fascinating, really, time of the sort of freedom that the Soviet space didn't see, certainly since probably the times of the Revolution of 1917.
No. And that freedom was, of course, even greater in 1991 at Christmas when the Soviet Union was dissolved. But before that, before we go there was a catastrophic disaster in Ukraine, which we in Sweden also experienced, the Chernobyl.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess this is my chance to say thank you to Sweden for alerting not just the world, but also us in Ukraine to the danger that came with the explosion in Chernobyl. And the story of Chernobyl, again, fascinated me from the very beginning, because that was also part of my story of people who were around me. At that time, I already had small children. We kept them in the house, in the apartment. I know my students who were drafted into the army, were sent to Chernobyl to really, now we know that, to perform the function of so-called biorobots, so going in the most dangerous places where the robots were not there or they malfunctioned and couldn't work. And the Chernobyl became really, really a time of awakening in many ways, because it's undermined the regime in the way that really was impossible before. One thing that radiation does, it doesn't distinguish between your social status. It doesn't distinguish between your religion and identity. It doesn't matter whether you're a member of the Communist Party, a general or a private. It affects everyone in a particular space. And part of that space, the areas that suffered the most were Ukraine. So it brings a sort of mobilization across the social, cultural, linguistic, and other lines that really was not there before. And it's also a very interesting story about the way how the authoritarian regimes that have full control over the information, how they really can undermine themselves by this insistence on the censorship and full control of the information. Because the political pushback that started with Chernobyl in Lithuania, in Ukraine, that led to the creation of the movement for independence. These are the same people who are mobilized. That was the first time that people went to the streets. They were on the streets and demanding from the government accountability, not about why the disaster happened, or not on the issue that the disaster was actually not enough resources were put to deal with that, not what they wanted. They demanded truth about Chernobyl. The truth meant show us the map of contamination. Tell us whether it's safe to live for us and our children and our parents in the area where we live. And the state would stonewall. They would not provide this information. So the mobilization was about the cover-up by the state rather than the issue that the explosion, the accident happened on its own. And the Soviet state turned out to be incapable of really living in any other way but concealing the truth. And once Chernobyl brought the process that became known as glasnost or openness, which is a kind of lifting some restrictions on the media, then it was just a matter of time before the entire infrastructure of the world's nuclear superpower collapsed. Chernobyl was a very important part of that story in Ukraine, but also when it comes to the Soviet Union as a whole, because I mentioned Lithuania. The first mobilization, people on the streets, were environmental protest, really produced by Chernobyl.
And in your book, you, as you say now also, you put more emphasis on this than perhaps on the United States' actions for ending the Cold War, that this was actually processes within the Soviet Union and that Ukraine played a very important role in this part.
Yes, absolutely, because the solution of the Soviet Union was a nightmare in the mind of the leaders of the United States of America. The U.S. was supporting Gorbachev, was supporting the Soviet Union. A few weeks before the coup and declaration of Ukrainian independence, President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, made his first and last visit to Kyiv to say to the Ukrainians that the Americans would not support those who tried to replace the faraway centralism with local dictatorship or something like that, and was lecturing Ukrainians that freedom and independence were different things. This is the American president came to Kyiv to draw this distinction between freedom and independence. So, yeah, the U.S. changed its position really a few days before the referendum for Ukrainian independence in December 1st of 1991. So for U.S., the nightmare was the question of what to do with the nuclear weapons. And U.S. felt very, very comfortable with the Soviet Union, how it evolved under Gorbachev as really a junior partner of the United States of America. The Iraq War of 1991, it was for the first time through the entire history of the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't use veto power to block the American operation, the American military action against Iraq that used to be the ally of the Soviet Union for a long period of time. So what was there not to like about the Soviet Union like that? So when today in Russia they're saying that it's evil Americans that destroyed the Soviet Union, my advice is, again, go back to the history textbooks or write books. That was not the case at all.
This history that has led up to the war that we're in now, your book doesn't cover the war because it ends just before the war. But what would you say, has this history prepared the Ukrainians for this war?
Yes, absolutely, because what we got in Ukraine is a particular phenomenon that is called a political nation. You read about political nations in the textbooks for university, but it's very difficult to find a political nation per se anywhere in the world, except in Ukraine. Ukraine has today the only president of Jewish background anywhere outside of Israel, despite the history of very, very tragic history of relations between Ukrainians and the Jews. You have the Minister of Defense, who is a Crimean Tatar, despite the long history of very difficult relations between the Christians and the Muslims and the Tatars, the nomads, or the nomadic part of Tatars in particular. You have the army which uses two languages in fighting back the Russian aggression. And my book tried to explain this phenomenon by using the paradigm that I discussed at the beginning of our conversation, the paradigm of Ukraine as gates of Europe, as a meeting place, where the common experience through the centuries really produced a form of a nation in which different languages and different cultures can find home. And find home to a degree that these people actually are prepared to take arms, to risk their lives, or to give their lives for the particular place called Ukraine, not for a particular language, not for a particular religion, for a particular place and its institutions. So I certainly hope that the history of Ukraine, the way how I tell it, not just treats the history right in a sense that it is true to the realities that were happening on the ground in the 13th century, or 16th century, or 19th century, but also tries to explain the origins and the roots of Ukrainian nation as it exists today and as it fights for its right to exist on the map, linguistic map, cultural map, political map of Europe.
Thank you very much, Serhii Plokhy.
Thank you very much for your questions. I really enjoyed our discussion.
för att du har lyssnat på Stolpe Stories. Missa inte att du som lyssnar har 20% rabatt på Bokförlaget Stolpes titlar hos bokus.com. Aktivera rabatten genom att ange koden Stolpe20. Och för att lyssna på fler avsnitt, följ oss där poddar finns och på sociala medier.